All right, let's jump into a deep dive on something I think is on a lot of people's minds these days. South Korea's economic future.
Yeah, definitely a lot of chatter about that.
Yeah, so we're looking at some reports from the OECD today, and they've got some pretty eye-opening predictions, I gotta say.
Absolutely. The OECD, when they talk, people listen. And they're definitely sending some cautionary signals.
Yeah. So right off the bat, the OECD has slashed their 2025 growth forecast for South Korea down to just 1.5%.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant drop from their previous prediction of 2.1%. So not exactly painting a rosy picture.
No, not at all. And what's even more striking is that this is actually in line with what other major institutions are saying.
Yeah, you've got the Bank of Korea, for example. They're also singing a similar tune. So it's not just the OECD waving a red flag here. It's a pretty consistent message coming from multiple sources.
Yeah, it seems like there's a real consensus forming. And this isn't just, a minor blip we're talking about either. It's a pretty substantial cut, especially when you consider how much South Korea relies on exports.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. South Korea's economy is heavily dependent on trade. So any slowdown in global demand is going to hit them pretty hard.
Yeah, and to put it into perspective, this decrease is actually steeper than the downward revision for the global average. So South Korea is getting hit disproportionately hard.
Exactly. And the OECD is pointing to a couple of key factors that are driving this gloomy outlook.
Okay, so let's dive into those. What are they seeing as the biggest culprits here?
Well, first and foremost, you've got President Trump's aggressive tariff policies. Those have really thrown a wrench into the works of global trade. And then on top of that, there's just a lot of uncertainty in the global landscape right now.
Yeah.
Geopolitical tensions, rising protectionism, gaining ground. It's not exactly a recipe for economic stability.
Right. So basically, we're talking about these trade wars and this kind of rising tide of protectionism that's creating a lot of volatility and making it really tough for export-driven economies like South Korea to thrive.
Precisely. It's like trying to navigate a ship through a storm. The waters are choppy, the winds are unpredictable, and it's hard to chart a clear course.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that the OECD is actually using some pretty strong language here. They're talking about the possibility of global economic fragmentation.
Yeah, that's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah.
What they're essentially saying is that the world economy could splinter into different blocks, with countries retreating inwards and focusing on regional trade rather than global trade.
So it's almost like we're going back in time to a more divided world.
In a way, yeah. It's a reversal of the trend we've seen over the past few decades towards globalization and interconnectedness. And the implications of that are pretty significant.
Yeah, so help me understand this a little better. What are the risks of this kind of fragmentation? What should people be worried about?
Well, for starters, it can lead to rising inflation as supply chains get disrupted and competition decreases.
Makes sense.
And then you've got increased pressure on government spending. Governments might feel compelled to prop up struggling industries or invest more in defense as tensions rise. And that can lead to higher taxes or cuts to other important programs.
So it's not just an economic issue, it's a social issue as well.
Absolutely. It affects every aspect of our lives. And on a global scale, fragmentation can exacerbate existing conflicts and even spark new ones.
So it's a pretty bleak picture so far, but surely there must be some potential bright spots, right? The OECD report must have highlighted something positive.
Well, yeah, there are a few glimmers of hope.
Okay, let's hear about those. What could potentially turn the tide?
Well, the OECD pointed out that if there were agreements reached to, ease tariffs or breakthroughs in some of these geopolitical conflicts, that could really create a more favorable environment for growth.
So there's still a chance for a more positive outcome, but it really hinges on these external factors that are largely outside of South Korea's control.
Exactly. It's a bit of a waiting game to see how things unfold on the global stage.
Right. So it sounds like South Korea's economic fate is intertwined with this complex web of international relations and trade policies.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder of how interconnected we all are in today's world.
Yeah. And it's not just about, sitting back and hoping for the best either. The OECD had some pretty specific advice for South Korea on how to navigate these choppy waters.
Okay, so let's dig into that a bit. What are they recommending?
Well, for the Bank of Korea, they emphasize the importance of keeping inflation under control.
Right. So basically, don't let prices spiral out of control.
Exactly.
Okay.
Inflation can really erode the purchasing power of people's incomes and make it harder for businesses to plan and invest.
Yeah, it's kind of a silent thief, right? It just chips away at your savings and your earnings without you even realizing it.
Exactly. And for the finance ministry, the OECD stressed the need for what they call fiscal sustainability.
Okay, fiscal sustainability. What does that mean in plain English?
It basically means making sure that the government spending is in line with its revenues, avoiding excessive deficits and debt. Right. So it's kind of like managing your household budget, but on a much larger scale.
Exactly. You've got to make sure you're not spending more than you're taking in.
Mm.
Otherwise, you end up in a whole heap of trouble down the road.
So basically, the OECD is calling for prudent and responsible economic management in the face of all this uncertainty.
Absolutely. It's about making smart choices today to prepare for a potentially bumpy road ahead.
And it's interesting because it's not just about avoiding the negative, right? It's also about positioning South Korea to seize opportunities when they arise.
Yeah, for sure. The OECD specifically mentioned the potential for agreements that could ease those tariff tensions we talked about earlier.
Right. So if those trade barriers start coming down, that could be a huge boost for South Korea's economy.
Absolutely. It would open up new markets, reduce cost, and create a more favorable environment for businesses to grow and thrive.
And what about those breakthroughs in geopolitical conflicts? Are we holding our breath for those?
Well, it's true that the world can feel pretty volatile right now, but even small steps towards resolution can make a big difference.
How so?
Well, when conflicts drag on, it creates a lot of uncertainty and risk aversion among businesses and investors. Nobody wants to put their money into a region that's perceived as unstable.
Right. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The longer the conflict lasts, the more it hurts the economy and the harder it is to recover.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you have a sense of stability and cooperation, it unlocks economic potential. Businesses are more willing to invest, trade flows more freely, and everyone benefits.
So it sounds like South Korea's economic future is really hanging in the balance here. It's dependent on this.
Sure. So, for example, we talked about how the U.S. might actually slow down because of its own tariff policies.
Right, because they're also imposing tariffs on goods from other countries like Canada and Mexico.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can end up hurting their own economy in the long run.
Yeah, it's kind of like shooting yourself in the foot, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to protect domestic industries, but you end up hurting consumers and businesses in the process.
Precisely. And then you have the case of China, which is actually projected to see its growth forecast increase.
So it seems like they might be able to weather the storm better than some other countries, at least for now.
Yeah, it's interesting how they're positioned. They have a large domestic market, and they're less reliant on exports than some other countries.
Right, so they're not as vulnerable to these global trade tensions.
Exactly. And they've also been very strategic in diversifying their trading partners and investing in new technologies.
So China's resilience in the face of all this is a major factor to keep an eye on. It could really shift the balance of power in the global economy.
Without a doubt. It's a whole new ballgame.
So what does this all mean for South Korea and, more importantly, for our listener?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You've got South Korea, facing a potentially turbulent economic future, and the U.S. may be shooting itself in the foot with its own tariffs, and then you've got China emerging as this potential powerhouse. It's a lot to digest.
It really is. So if we kind of take a step back and look at all these trends, what's the big takeaway here? What can we learn from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest lesson is that the global economy is constantly evolving, and there's a lot of uncertainty right now. There are definitely risks out there, but there are also opportunities. And it's up to each country to navigate those challenges and position themselves for success.
And in South Korea's case, it sounds like a lot of that comes down to making smart policy choices. Things like keeping inflation under control and being fiscally responsible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those might seem like abstract concepts, but they have a very real impact on people's everyday lives. Inflation erodes the value of your savings and your earnings, and when governments overspend, it often leads to higher taxes or cuts to important services.
Right, so it's not just about economic theory, it's about real people and their livelihoods.
Absolutely. And beyond those kind of internal factors, there's this whole issue of navigating this increasingly complex global landscape. It's like trying to sail a ship through a storm. You need to constantly be aware of the winds and the currents and adjust your course accordingly.
And in this case, the winds and the currents are things like trade policies and geopolitical events and the actions of other major players like the U.S. and China.
Exactly. South Korea needs to be agile and adaptable and able to respond to these shifts in the global landscape.
So what does all of this mean for our listener? What can they do to prepare for this uncertain future?
Well, first and foremost, knowledge is power. The more you understand about what's happening in the world and how it might affect you, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions. So stay informed. Read different perspectives. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
It's also about being adaptable and open to new opportunities. These shifts in the global economy could create challenges, but they could also create new avenues for growth and innovation.
Absolutely. If certain industries are struggling because of trade barriers, maybe there's a chance for other industries to emerge or expand. Or maybe there are ways to diversify your investments or develop new skills that will be in demand in this changing landscape.
So it's not just about reacting to change. It's about anticipating it and positioning yourself to benefit from it.
Precisely. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all navigating these challenges together. So talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues. Share information. Brainstorm ideas, support each other.
That's a great point. We're all in this together. So let's stay informed, stay connected, and stay adaptable.
I love that stay informed, connected, and adaptable words to live by in these uncertain times.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the challenges facing South Korea's economy, the factors driving those challenges, and some potential ways forward. Hopefully you're feeling a bit more informed and empowered to navigate this complex landscape.
And a little bit more curious about the world around us. Because at the end of the day, curiosity is what drives us to learn and adapt and thrive no matter what challenges we face.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and remember, stay curious.